All right, here is a bare bones introduction to the skeletal system. You should get these notes in your notebook, and you can refer to these note slides later. I'll post them next week so you can review them and refer to the diagrams. So what are the various types of bones? You have a diagram that outlines those, but we want to go through and talk about each one and give some examples, so maybe it's a little easier for you to understand. So long bones are ones most people are familiar with. Short bones, not so much. Flat bones are flat in certain sections, but not necessarily the entire bone. And irregular bones are kind of obvious when you see examples. And then sesamoid, the floating bones. So we're going to talk about examples of each of those. So long bone examples, humerus, femur, those are two of the major ones that usually come to mind for people, the long bones of your legs or your arms. And even the bones of your fingers. But one thing to notice about long bones, they usually have a longer, skinnier part, and then they widen at the end. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on. So you are going to hopefully be able to identify some of these bones using skeleton to ID. But notice this would be a hip joint. So this would be your femur. This is your elbow joint. So the ulna and the radius go together. And then phalanges, finger bones. Short bone examples. In your wrist. Your wrist bones each have a name, and they're considered short bones. Your ankles, too. We are not going to learn the specific names of each of the wrist bones, but I want you to understand the type of bone they are and what we collectively call them. So hopefully you learned about carpals and metacarpals. You will hear those terms again. Those are bones of your ankle. Tarsals and metatarsals, relating to the general feet bones. We're not going to learn the specific names of each one, but we'll learn generally what we call those. Flat bone examples. They kind of seem strange. They are ribs and they're curved, but those rib bones have a flattened shape to them. If you've ever eaten ribs off the barbecue, you kind of know the shape of those bones. They are kind of flattened bones. You also have a sternum that can be broken up into some different parts, fused together. So those bones are flattened. And even though they curve to make a sphere when you put them together around your skull or around your brain, the skull bones are considered flat bones as well. Irregular bones frame your hips, your pelvis, and your tailbone. So those are some specific bones that make up that pelvic girdle. And vertebrae are another good example of irregular bones. And sesamoid bones are called floating bones, meaning they don't attach directly to another bone. So maybe you recognize this as your kneecap, the patella. And underneath your jaw, where your tongue muscle is attached to the hyoid bone. What is the widened end of a long bone called? It has a specific name I mentioned. That there's that wider part of a long bone, like your femur or your humerus. That widened end of a long bone is called the epiphysis. Epiphysis. The long, skinny part of those bones is called the diaphysis. So we want to know the epiphysis and diaphysis of long bones. And we want to understand that there's stuff inside those long bones and different types of bone. So bone can be categorized, or bone tissue can be categorized by its density. And we talk about compact bone versus spongy bone. So if you open up or do a cross-section of a long bone, you've got sections of it where it's compact bone, very dense, and spongy bone is less dense. There's a lot of holes in it. The long bones also have a cavity in them called the medullary cavity, which you'll need to know. So what is the cavity of the diaphysis called? I just gave it to you, the medullary cavity. What's inside of the medullary cavity? Well, most people know that inside your bones there is stuff called marrow, bone marrow. And there are two types of marrow, red and yellow. And what is marrow all about? Well, we're going to explore that a little bit more too. But we do know, or hopefully you know, that blood cell formation occurs in the marrow inside the bones. So as adults, all the red marrow you have is confined to the spongy bone. Bones are covered in a fibrous or connective tissue membrane. There's a name for that covering on these bones, and so you should get familiar with this term called the periosteum. Oste is almost always referring to bone. When you hear that oste, O-S-T-E, osteocytes, bone cells. So kind of keep that. Ossification is the formation of bone. Osteoporosis is porous bones that you don't want. My grandma had that. My mom started getting that when she was older. So oste is bone. Where is growth determined in long bones? For example, how do you get taller? Well, these bones have to stretch out, and they stretch out at growth plates in those bones. And the growth plates are called, or that area is called the epiphyseal line. The epiphyseal line, or plate. So they call it a growth plate while it's still forming and growing. And then once it fully hardens and ossifies and you're done growing, I think they call it the epiphyseal line. So it's referred to a growth plate prior to growth being finished, and then when it's finished and the bone completely hardens in that spot, the epiphyseal line. And so it's at the ends of our long bones. Here's an example of this bone would be done growing. It's an epiphyseal line. What fills the compact bone so nutrients, waste, and information can get through? We want to understand that bones have stuff in them other than solid connective tissue or bone. So there's that canal system that is chock full of nerves and blood supply. So if you've ever broken a bone, or you know someone's broken a bone, it's very painful, because when that bone is broken, that bone out of place is putting pressure on every nerve that is going through the bone in that area. And so it's super painful. And if bone is where blood is formed, then you know blood supply has to also be part of what's going through bones. And inside of those bones are called osteocytes, little cavities in which the osteocytes reside are called lacunae. So we're going to explore how the bone is put together, how that compact bone is structured. What's a bone cell called, and where are they found? As I mentioned, called osteocytes. Cavities that osteocytes are found are called lacunae. Here's a close-up diagram. And so if you looked under a microscope, you'd see these little things. They almost look like nerve cells, but that's just the cavity inside the bone itself, and then the cell is the osteocyte inside of there. So this is the cell in this space. What cells form bone? They're called osteoblasts, which is kind of weird because you think of blasting as exploding and breaking, but it's the opposite here. Osteoblasts build, so B for build, bone. When you need to take out some calcium to get maybe increase your blood calcium to break down bone, osteoclasts do that. Osteoblasts build bones, osteoclasts break down bone. So how do osteoclasts break down bone? So when we need some more blood calcium, we can draw from our bone bank of calcium. And so your endocrine system is helping with that. The parathyroid hormone is secreted into your blood and then signaling to break down some of the bone tissue. So it releases calcium into the blood that you might need. If calcium in the blood is too high, it can then be redeposited into our bones by the help of the osteoblasts. Blasts build. Growing part of bone is made up of something called hyaline cartilage, another type of connective tissue. And that's where osteoblasts reside, because they're going to be forming bone on either side of that epiphyseal plate. Hyaline cartilage is very strong and has a slippery surface at the movable joints. And so that's the bare bones introduction to the skeletal system.